When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so take a look at our friends over at Linode. With the launch of their managed Kubernetes platform, it's easy to get started with the next generation of deployment and scaling, powered by the battle-tested Linode platform, including simple pricing, node balancers, 40 gigabit networking, dedicated CPU and GPU instances, S3-compatible object storage, and worldwide data centers. Go to pythonpodcast.com/Linode, that's Linode today, and get a $60 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. You listen to this show because you love Python and want to keep your skills up to date, and machine learning is finding its way into every aspect of software engineering. Springboard has partnered with us to help you take the next step in your career by offering a scholarship to their Machine Learning Engineering Career Track program. In this online, project-based course, every student is paired with a machine learning expert who provides unlimited one-to-one mentorship support throughout the program via video conferences. You'll build up your portfolio of machine learning projects and gain hands-on experience in writing machine learning algorithms, deploying models into production, and managing the lifecycle of a deep learning prototype. Springboard offers a job guarantee, meaning that you don't have to pay for the program until you get a job in the space. Podcast.init is exclusively offering listeners 20 scholarships of $500 to eligible applicants. It only takes 10 minutes and there's no obligation. Go to pythonpodcast.com/springboard and apply today, and make sure to use the code AISpringboard when you enroll. Your host as usual is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Tim Glaser about PostHog, an open source platform for product analytics. So Tim, can you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, hey, thanks, Tobias. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so I'm Tim Glaser, CTO and co-founder of PostHog. As you said, we do open source product analytics. So think something like Mixpanel or Amplitude, but completely open source. You can host it yourself and have full control over the data.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
I actually don't remember the specific point, but I started programming when I was fairly young, sort of when I was, sort of 10 years old with HTML, and then had a couple of jobs throughout high school that were mostly PHP, and then I ended up working for Cloud9 where we used Node. But I think sometime in between there, I started playing around with Python. But the first time I touched Python professionally was at a company called Arachnus, where I spent the last sort of 4 years before starting PostHog.
And so in terms of PostHog itself, can you give a bit of a description about what it is and what motivated you to build it?
Sure. So like I said, it's really a platform that you can host yourself. And it's a platform you can host yourself that allows you to figure out what your users are doing on your app, on your website, and it will help you build a better product, basically, by having all that information. So the category of product analytics is fairly well established, right? You have companies like Mixpanel, Amplitude, Heap. There's a bunch of others that, we can kind of dig into. But the thing they all kind of lacked is, and we used a bunch of them before starting PostHog, specifically, things like Mixpanel. The problem was those tools are all really built for product managers, product owners, those kinds of people. And I used to be one myself, so I can kind of relate. But the thing they don't do very well is make it accessible to engineers. If you go around companies that use those kind of platforms, the only engineer that tends to have access to those platforms is the engineer that installed it. And then he probably hasn't looked at, they probably haven't looked at it since. So that's why we kind of started PostHog. We wanted to build something for engineers, something that they could use and they could look at. Because in the end, engineers tend to make a lot of product decisions de facto, but at the moment tend to do it without any data, without having access to it, etc. So that's kind of the overarching philosophy that, why we started it. We felt quite strongly that, especially tools like Mixpanel, they charge you an arm and leg for getting access to your data. It tends to come with like the highest price point plan. And to us, that felt really silly because it's your data, you've kind of generated it. You should be able to do with it what you want. You should be able to do analytics on it. You should be able to run queries against it. So that's why we wanted to open source it. It didn't feel right to us that you should send all this data off to third parties.
And also with the introduction of GDPR and CCPA and just the overall increase in awareness of consumer privacy, the sort of miasma that has begun to surround those different types of products as well is even more motivation to have greater control over who's using your data and what they're using it for, rather than handing it off to Google Analytics or whoever else for being able to improve their own products just because it happens to be free for you.
Obviously, GDPR, etc. Those are big motivations for it. As engineers, you're always super like aware of who's using your data and what, and it just felt right to us that it should be something that you can control rather than, like you said, sending it off to whatever. And certainly with things like Mixpanel and Amplitude, they really encourage you to send as much data as possible about your users, email addresses, addresses, all that stuff, and that's all hosted on their servers, and you can't kind of do anything with it from that point on.
And in terms of PostHog itself, you mentioned that one of the goals is to be more engineer focused. And I'm wondering who the overall target audience is for PostHog itself and some of the challenges that come along with building an analytics platform with the developer in mind.
Yeah, so the target audience is definitely engineers over product manager or owners at the moment. We strongly believe that engineers need access to this data as much as those kind of groups of people. So our target audience really is kind of any engineer in any organization, but it's at the moment a lot of people that are installing it are kind of engineers at smaller organizations. They have a handful of engineers that there's no formal product role yet, but the engineers want to know what's happening in their product and who's using it and how they're using it. That's why they're installing us.
And in the description of PostHog, and as you mentioned at the beginning, it's described as being a product-focused analytics platform, and you draw the contrast to session-based analytics in the README of the project. So I'm wondering what the meaningful differences are between the two in terms of the types of data that are collected and the use cases that they benefit from.
Yeah, absolutely. So something like Google Analytics won't, unless you're paying them a lot of money, won't give you statistics or kind of data on individual users, which, that kind of makes sense if you're maybe running, something like a media platform, for example. If you're running like an online news website, you don't actually care who the individual users are or what they've done. You kind of just care that, okay, this article got this many hits, etc. That doesn't work quite as well for products, right? Because if you have like a B2B or even B2C kind of product, your users are going to be very different and behave very differently based on who they are. The customer that's paying you $1 million a year, they use the product very differently than the customer that's paying you $10 a year. So you kind of want to be able to segment on those things. And that's where, the original wave of product analytics came in, right? Mixpanel, Amplitude, etc. And they absolutely nailed that kind of use case. And they've done really well out of it. We're not really innovating there, to be honest. The place where we've innovated is open source, right? We have taken something that has clearly proved to work very well. Obviously, both Amplitude and Mixpanel are sizable companies with a lot of really dedicated users. And what we've done is just made it work for engineers. And that's the real power of it. Like I kind of joke about it with some of the people on my team sometimes, but the product development for PostHog wasn't that difficult because it was very well defined what we had to build because it kind of already existed. And there's a bunch of places where we thought we could do better, but the real innovation was just being able to self-host it. And we've seen a lot of use cases where it's really hard in especially big organizations to get any software kind of installed because you have to go through all sorts of processes, etc. But as soon as something is MIT licensed, it tends to be really easy. So yeah, that's just kind of where we've come from.
And so using open source as the differentiating factor has a lot of benefits in terms of gaining broad-based adoption for people who are interested in this kind of thing and want to be able to just pull something off the shelf and experiment with it. But in terms of the actual capabilities of the product that would help to sell it to the people who are actually going to eventually write the check to pay for support or pay for managed hosting, what are some of the capabilities of PostHog that make it stand out in such a crowded marketplace?
Sure. So part of it, obviously, I guess that there's at the moment, if you're a large organization and you want something like product analytics, you probably have two choices. Choice number one is you go to something like Mixpanel or Amplitude and you pay them a small fortune and you get access to their products, but you don't get access to the underlying data. Sometimes you can pay them to put it in a data warehouse, maybe, but the data isn't stored in your servers or whatever. The other side of it is using something like Snowplow and Snowflake, and then using something like Tableau or Looker on the other side to do data analytics. And this is what we've seen. We've talked to a bunch of people who've gone that route. So they started with Amplitude Mixpanel. That became too expensive. They wanted to keep more control over the data. So they went to something like the setup I described. So Snowflake, Snowplow, Looker. The issue with that is you end up having to hire, a data science team basically that the rest of your organization needs to ping to build dashboards. And, it's very hard to build even like a basic funnel, for example. So we think there's like a massive gap between the two, where something with the ease and the usability of Mixpanel Amplitude, but that you can host yourself, you can have complete control over it as you would with the kind of Snowflake, Snowplow setup.
And for people who already have an analytics platform in place, whether it's session-based and they're using Google Analytics or Matomo, or they're already using a product-focused tool such as Heap or Mixpanel, and they're interested in using PostHog, do you have any sort of migration path for being able to pull data from those systems to populate your platform with the information that has already been collected, or would it end up having to be just a clean cut over where they start new with PostHog and just use that going forward?
Yeah, we've mostly seen kind of clean cut migrations. Part of that is, like I said, unless this depends per provider, but unless you're paying a lot of them a lot of money, it's actually really hard to get the data out. A lot of the times they won't let you. So there's no way for us to import it anyway. And something like Google Analytics, again, because they're like session based, we can't, there's no way of kind of marrying it up, I guess. So a lot of times what we see is it is just a clear cut kind of transition. And it's something I would love to kind of do better, I guess, but it's just something that has kind of been made hard. But the thing with these analytics is like, a lot of them have 90-day retention of data, for example. And the reason is data older than that tends not to be very relevant to what you're doing now, because your product changes, your website changes. So, even if you have if you have PostHog running side by side with those tools, after a couple of weeks, a month, you probably have enough data in PostHog or whatever the new service is that you can do the right level of analytics with it.
And as I was going through the documentation, one of the things that stood out to me about the way that you're approaching the event collection in PostHog is that you are taking a similar approach to Heap, in that you're automatically collecting everything so that after the fact you can then decide that any particular signal is useful and incorporate it into some sort of dashboard, versus having to spend the engineering time to say that you want to start collecting something new and then have to wait for it to come in. And I'm wondering what you have found to be the utility of that approach and any challenges that come along with it.
The utility of it, of course, is it allows you to kind of what you said, right? It allows you not to spend engineering resources on adding, dot track functions everywhere. And those functions, sometimes it's one engineer who's really enthusiastic, and she'll add it, everywhere in one go, and then it kind of languishes, and the rest of the team doesn't take it up. So we've seen that doesn't tend to be a super reliable way of making sure your tracking is up to date. And, it allows kind of less technical users to go in and kind of define what they want to look at. And it allows you to, do backwards looking stuff. So even if you haven't installed the dot track functionality, you can still go in and, work out what's happened. The downsides or the challenges that we've seen with that is, it tends to be basically the hellscape that is, DOM, right? You still have to kind of work with the DOM, and sometimes the way, for example, like CSS in JS, right? It's great, but it creates class names that are, completely meaningless basically to anyone else. So that makes it quite challenging to write selectors that work for it. And then, we have like a click and point and click interface to kind of defining these events. But if your class names are like dynamically generated, that's not going to work. So that's the challenge. And like, you definitely get more reliability if you do kind of dot track calls everywhere in your code, but you lose some of the flexibility. So you work out, and obviously, like, we also allow you to do dot track calls if you want. Yeah, it's kind of just a free extra option, and we've seen a lot of use from it.
And for somebody who is using PostHog, can you talk through just the overall workflow of the data collection and then being able to build useful dashboards out of it, and any integration or enrichment of data sources from either additional platforms that you're using, whether it's SaaS or otherwise, or being able to collect information from things like mobile applications?
Sure. So, if you sign up for an account on, you deploy PostHog to Heroku or AWS, whatever it is, we give you a super simple snippet. You put that in your website and you start collecting from the word go. That's the super basic kind of version, and that will allow you to do quite a bit of analytics, and we start collecting events straight off. We have libraries for most popular kind of libraries and languages. So we have, React Native, iOS, Android, we have Python, Ruby, Go, etc., etc. So you can start collecting events from the backend as well. The thing that's most challenging, and this is challenging with all of the kind of product focused analytics, is that you need to marry up what happens, what the users are doing in the front end with what users are doing in the back end. Now, maybe you don't need analytics in the back end, in which case it's a lot easier, but you basically need to send something that uniquely identifies the user. So, a user ID. So you can kind of like make sure that all the events that one user does correctly get grouped under one user. So that's kind of how there tends to be a little bit of challenging that, and we've made it as easy as possible. But it's a challenge whether you use Amplitude or Mixpanel or PostHog. Then the next step is, in PostHog is you start creating some dashboards. So you've got all this data. We pre-create some of the dashboards for you, but we have kind of like a graph interface that is really powerful, allows you to do all sorts of analytics, things like stickiness, like retention. It allows you to filter by kind of any property that you send, or we send a bunch of properties automatically. So it allows you to create really powerful dashboards really, really quickly.
And in terms of the collection of the data too, one of the challenges can be in making sure that the structure of the event is able to be joined across the different platforms. So I'm wondering what your approach has been in terms of enforcing some sort of default schema or default attributes for being able to then collect the information across multiple different sites or platforms and then join it across them.
Yeah, so I guess the upside is, we control all the client libraries as well. So it means that all of the attributes across the libraries are consistent. In terms of marrying up the users, we have kind of unified calls. Basically, the thing you do is you just send us a user ID, and that will mean that everything that one user does, if they're logged in on your app or whatever, gets attributed to that user. So there's a couple of ways we kind of make sure that all of the data is consistent across, whether you've got data coming in from your iOS app or your marketing website or, your online app, that it all kind of works together.
And that's another interesting thing, too, about this thought of product analytics is that for things like Google Analytics or Matomo, it's very much that the statistics are collected in this discrete entity of one website. And then there is the possibility of being able to view traffic across different properties, but it's not a first-class concern. Whereas, as I was looking through the documentation for PostHog, it seems that there is much more built-in functionality for being able to say that the information that I'm collecting in this project is something that pertains to the marketing website, as you said, and your web application and maybe your mobile device. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the utility of treating the different properties as a single overall experience versus treating everything as a discrete entity in its own right.
It's super important. And I think, talk to any marketeer and they love talking about, and in fact, my girlfriend is a senior marketing manager, and she loves talking about things like first touch, last touch. It's so crucial to, especially kind of marketing. But then that filters down into the product, right? You want to know how people first found you, whether that if you're doing paid ads, for example, you want to know, okay, is my Facebook campaign working? But if your KPI is someone goes to your website, sees an ad, goes to your website, then downloads an app, then signs up on the app, you want to be able to kind of track people across all of that, ideally, because then you can say, okay, the kinds of users that do, for example, Slack knows that if you join like a couple of channels, it knows that you're basically hooked for life. And Netflix has something similar, right? Where if you watch a couple of movies, you're going to be hooked for life, basically, or for a long time. If that's your KPI, but that lives in your mobile app, and you're spending a ton of money getting people, from Facebook onto your website, you want to make sure that the types of campaigns that bring people to the website are the types of campaigns that then eventually lead people to do whatever that action is in your app. So, marrying the two up is a massive challenge, but if you get it right, especially in big organizations, it can be so powerful because it just allows you to, if you're doing paid marketing, spend much more effectively, or if you're doing content marketing, to focus on the things that really matter.
In terms of PostHog itself, can you talk through how it's implemented and how the overall design and architecture of the system has evolved since you first began building it?
Yeah, sure. So I sort of consider myself to be, a fairly average developer, and I like libraries and frameworks that are well tested, that are a little bit boring, but that just do the job. So I started with just Django and like a very basic React app, and that's basically still what it is today. Obviously, we've expanded things massively. So, but in essence, it's basically a Django app. It's got we use a Django REST framework for all the API endpoints. It's a single page application in React. And we use something called Kia for our state management. So we actually hired Marius, who wrote the Kia framework. It's basically just a layer on top of Redux that takes away a lot of the boilerplate of writing kind of Redux code. And it's really helped us structure our code base much better. So that was probably the single biggest like architecture change that we made. Because before, obviously it's all open source, so you can see exactly how I kind of stuffed this up. But we would just have like huge classes of React components that did a bunch of magic stuff. It would call APIs left, right, center, and we slowly started migrating to using Kia. So basically, having some kind of state management in the app, and it's made the world of difference. So that's definitely been the biggest challenge, or the biggest change.
And using Django, as you said, it's a boring technology. It's something that's been battle tested for a long time. And because of the fact that you're building something that is very heavy on the data ingestion and data analytics side of things, I'm wondering what you have found to be its overall capability in terms of performance and any issues that you're seeing in scaling to larger volumes of data and larger volumes of interactions for maybe large properties.
Yeah, so on the analytics side, it's kind of, the database does most of the heavy lifting. The event insertion, we are definitely starting to run up against some issues. So actually, something that we have generally been working on this week is, I won't get into too much detail, but the basic problem is every time we insert an event, we have to work out if that event is part of an action. We call them actions. It's basically a wrapper around something like an auto-captured event that makes it human readable. So if you have a call to action on your website that's like sign up, you can create an action that's called sign up and then use our point and click interface to work out what button is the sign up button. Now, every time we do an event insert, we kind of check whether that event is part of an action. And we create this like fairly horrible SQL query to work this out. The database handles it absolutely fine, but the Django ORM is just quite slow in generating it. And it's actually brought down some people that were experiencing like high volumes. And we had to quickly remove those actions to make sure it worked. So that's something we're looking at the moment. So I think possibly for the event ingestion, we might move away from the Django ORM, or we might just cache the results of that query, or whatever it is. But apart from that, I absolutely love Django. I think it's one of the best things, certainly in kind of like the Python community, and it just allows, we could have never built PostHog as quickly as we've done without Django.
Since you have gotten decently far along in the product, I'm wondering what your thoughts are reflecting back on the initial decisions of using Python and Django for building this platform out, and any considerations that you might have done differently now that you are further along in the journey.
I would absolutely use Python again, and I would absolutely use Django again. Some of the other mistakes definitely have been in the front end, as I said, around kind of state management, and I sort of wish we'd used TypeScript. I sort of wish we used kind of testing, but absolutely use typing in Python is great. And the Django stubs library is a little bit funky sometimes, but it's getting better, and that has saved us quite a few times, just having strong typing everywhere, kind of enforcing that across the code base. I guess doing differently, and this is maybe a little bit niche, but we definitely have kind of large functions in our Django REST like API framework. So some of the some of the kind of view sets and serializers are really, really big. And I think the sort of accepted wisdom these days is to have sort of a middle layer between models and the API. And we still kind of struggle to place things. So some of the logic is in like models, some of the logic is in the API, the API layer, and we're constantly not quite sure where any of it belongs. And I think if we'd had some kind of like structured middle layer, that would have been useful.
And because of the fact that this is very IO heavy, I'm wondering if you've put any thought into using the channels capabilities in Django. I know that looking at your requirements that you're on version 3, so it should be able to support the ASCII interface and use channels to maybe give you some extra performance while still being able to take advantage of all of the stability that Django offers.
And mostly for kind of event insertion, you're talking about them?
Yeah, primarily for the critical path of getting data into and out of the system.
It's to be perfectly honest, it's something we haven't considered yet. We our JS library is fairly simple. We do batching basically, for example, of event insertions, and we do some clever stuff around that on that side. But no, we haven't really looked at kind of event insertion using channels. To be perfectly honest, something we should consider.
And one of the interesting things that I've seen from looking at a lot of the different open source analytics offerings, it seems that most of them are implemented in PHP, whether because of the success of the LAMP stack or the success of WordPress and their desire to be able to play within that same ecosystem. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the trade-offs of PHP as the implementation target for these analytics platforms versus the benefits that you're seeing of building it on top of Django.
In the same way that if you go to Sentry's GitHub, it says it doesn't have much text in the like README, but the one thing it says is the Sentry server is written in Python, but you can use any library or any language to send events to Sentry. That's kind of how I think about it as well. Like the fact that we're written in Django is kind of irrelevant to how people send us events, because we've got, we have a PHP library and we have a Ruby library, and they're all as good as the Python library. So we don't really care what you write, what your system is written in, because we will probably have a library for it. I think the question of what we're implemented in is almost like less interesting. We did have an employee from a large Canadian bank that will remain unnamed reach out to us and be like, we really love what PostHog is doing, but we wish it was written in Java. And I guess basically the reason they wanted that is maybe they wanted to expand it and hack on it. But apart from that, I think what libraries you offer is more important than what you write the software itself in.
Yeah, it's just interesting to me that it's actually taken so long for there to be a decent option in Python for building a web analytics platform or an event analytics platform versus the plethora of solutions that have cropped up in PHP, probably just because of the fact that PHP has had such a dominance over the web for a while, at least until the frameworks like Django and Rails have come about. And on the subject of PostHog being implemented in Django, I'm wondering what you see as the viability of potentially offering it as a pluggable app for other Django projects to be able to embed within them versus running it entirely as its own hosted platform.
Yeah, that's super interesting to me. We've had quite a lot of people talk to us about wanting to kind of offer PostHog as a thing to their customers. So you can imagine if you're building a website builder, for example, you want to give your customer analytics information, how many page views did you get, where did people come from, etc. So kind of using PostHog for that. Specifically for the Django app, I think that is a good idea. I think we are gonna, in the same way that Sentry, for example, has like only a couple of options on how, quite specific options how to deploy it. We require like Celery, we require a Redis server, we require quite a bit of config sometimes to make sure that we're up and running. We abstract a lot of that away by having like an app.json thing for Heroku, and having Docker images and a Docker Compose file, having like Terraform, CloudFormation, all that stuff. So I wonder if how feasible it is to like expect people to set up all that config in their own Django app just so they can use it as a side project. But apart from that, there's been quite a few use cases of people kind of serving PostHog to their customers in some way, shape, or form. And it's definitely something that we want to encourage.
And as far as the utility of PostHog, some of the benefits that come about from having access to the underlying data and having the APIs available to it is the option for integration and extensibility. So I'm wondering what you view and what is already existing in terms of the options for extension and pluggability or integration points for people who want to use PostHog within the broader context of their systems.
Yeah, the thing that we see a lot of is people are just deploying it themselves, on their own systems, and then obviously we all the events get stored in Postgres. What we see a lot of is people then using the data from Postgres to do something else. So really using PostHog as a event collection thing. They use all of our libraries on their websites and on the iOS apps and whatever to send events to the PostHog instance. And then on the back end, they don't really use the PostHog analytics. They kind of use the database and do it that way. We do also have a couple of people using us via the API. So basically, again, kind of same story. They set PostHog up as an event ingestion thing, and then they use the APIs to use our, because we have put quite a lot of effort into making APIs. They're super powerful, and that obviously we use in the front end to allow you to do all sorts of analytics. But then, if you want to use the API, obviously go ahead. That's kind of the point of the exercise.
And on the point of scale as well, a lot of people, as they get to a certain point of volumes of data, they start to look to data lakes, or if they're more interested in sort of responsive analytics, the data warehouse approach. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the utility of PostHog within those contexts, or the overall integration path for exposing PostHog as a data source for those different systems, either via an ELT integration or things like that.
I think the first thing that I would say is it is amazing how far Postgres can go. For example, I'm fairly sure Heap is still using Postgres. There's a bunch of companies that have servers with a terabyte of memory to run a massive kind of Postgres database. So I think Postgres can go much further than people give it credit for. And our main focus at the moment is just to support even super quite high volume customers with Postgres. However, we absolutely think that there will be a time, we've had inbound interest from, kind of B2C, large, well-known B2C companies, and they'll be doing volumes that, even if you pull every trick in the book, you might not get there with Postgres. And they might already have something set up, right? So in those cases, we absolutely want to integrate with those data warehouses. But we kind of see that as, I think the way we're looking at that at the moment is we're just going to kind of wait and see until someone approaches us with that question, and then we're going to work with them to implement that. It's not something we think we need to actively, for me at the moment, what I care about most is the individual developer being able to install it quickly, being able to get something up and running super quickly. It's stable, it works really well, it does everything Amplitude Mixpanel will do and more. So that's where most of our focus is right now. And then, if someone comes in and wants to use a data warehouse with us, we'll very happily work with them to make that happen.
And the other aspect of building an analytics platform, and you mentioned that you have some pre-built dashboards for people who are getting started with PostHog to get them up and running, is just the overall aspect of making sure that the presentation of the data and the presentation of how to query and investigate the data is accessible and understandable for the people using it. And I'm wondering what you have seen as being the challenges of providing an interface that is intuitive and still able to be expressive enough for power users who want to be able to dig deep and do their own analysis.
Yeah, this is probably something, I think I underestimated when starting PostHog. You look at some analytics tools and you're like, it's just a couple of options. But the real challenge is in the permutations of the options, right? So if you log into PostHog, there's a couple of fields that you can change, and it actually looks deceptively simple, but it's really, really powerful. And obviously, if you do the maths on the number of different settings you could use to create a graph, it's immense. So kind of testing that and making sure all of those permutations work is quite challenging. But what we found also is that, and again, with some of the other tools, they have like different views for each variation of they have a view for retention, they have a view for aggregates by people, etc. We've actually managed to get all of that in one view, that still looks kind of deceptively simple. And I think the way we've done that is really just take the essence of what do you really, what do users really care about seeing, and kind of taking that really user-centric approach to building it, rather than this is what our system is technically capable of.
And once you have all the information collected and you're viewing the results and the graphs that show you the different trend analysis or the behavioral patterns of your users, what is the useful next step from that? And what are some of the ways that you can provide some useful sort of constructive feedback in terms of this is the structure of the events, and then this is the actual benefit that you can gain by having this knowledge, and some concrete actions that you can take to improve the growth and viability of your company or your project or your product?
Certainly, if you just started using product analytics, it's surprising how non-deep you have to go to find insights that will help you build a better product. So, my favorite example is it tends to be really easy to create a funnel in any product analytics platform, and really just by looking at that funnel and seeing where people drop out, double your conversion rate. So if you've got a web shop or a product that takes someone from the homepage all the way to paying, to putting their credit card in, if you create that funnel with all of the steps, and then just see where people drop off the most, and then do your best to improve that, you can get a huge amount of huge uptick in conversion rates just from that. I guess the other thing that tends to be really insightful is a lot of people, and especially kind of engineers, don't know how users use their product. Do you really know, like, okay, you have a sidebar with 7 menu items, but do you know which of those people are actually using? What's the top 1 or 2 actions that people do most in your system? And it will surprise you. Even obviously we're using PostHog to track PostHog. It always surprises us what people end up using the most. It's screens that we have given no thought to, no effort to. We slap together in half a day, and those tend to be the most popular screens. So being able to then kind of divert some focus you would have otherwise spent on a screen that no one looks at, and you're now suddenly spending it on the second most popular screen. Those are huge advantages. And at the moment, the way our product works and the way all of the other kind of product analytics products work is you have to sit there and kind of create a dashboard, or filter a graph down to get these insights. And that's useful. And it's especially useful if you're someone who likes spending their time looking at dashboards and like playing around with it, as I am. But a lot of engineers, I think, don't want to create a dashboard to work out what's going on in their product. So the next thing that we're working on is basically a toolbar that we, sort of spare the technical details, but inject into your website. So if you're logged into PostHog, it will show you a little icon that you can click or open the toolbar, and that will show you exactly what people are doing on your website. So it's sort of a heat map, but it actually gives you a lot more information than that. So when you're developing, when you're looking at your own app, your own product, you can see exactly where people drop off and where they get stuck, where they get confused, and also, like, surprisingly, where people are clicking the most. And that might be something totally different from what you thought. So I think that's kind of the next step of this. We focused with PostHog first on getting the dashboards and the graphs, etc., to kind of get to parity. But the next step for us is that toolbar to make it, to bring the statistics and the analytics to where you're working.
Yeah, as I was looking through the roadmap document that you have on your site, and I'll link to it in the show notes, it was interesting to see some of your vision of where you think you can go with PostHog now that you've got this foundational layer of product analytics. It's functional. You're able to collect events and view insights from it, but then being able to incorporate that into the inner loop of the development cycle so that you can surface that information at the time that you're actually building the application and building the platform that you're building the analytics for, and seeing how the analytics interacts. Whereas a lot of times the collection of events and the usage of analytics is a second concern and something that you implement because somebody in the marketing or sales department asked for it, not because it's something that you are actually engineering as a first-class consideration into the platform. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of the capabilities that you can unlock in the overall development of these systems and the ways that PostHog can be integrated into the overall lifecycle of applications.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is where it gets really exciting. So, like you said, we've kind of built the foundational layer now, and we're kind of sort of 80% to parity with the other tools, and I think it's the important 80%. Yeah. So the next steps for us are one is that toolbar, and that's going to be super crucial. Like you said, bringing the data to where you're developing right in the moment that you're developing, not as an afterthought. We think that's super crucial. We also think that's really just, and this is kind of talking longer term, but we really think there's a place for a kind of in the same way GitLab, went from being a GitHub clone to being an all-encompassing sort of DevOps CI/CD lifecycle behemoth. We think there's a similar place in analytics. So, at the moment, we're happily kind of ingesting all these events. We're gathering some super interesting data. The next obvious places that we're going to use that, like I said, the toolbar, but we're also thinking of things like A/B testing, for example. So, why do you have to buy something like Google Analytics and Optimizely and like Launch Darkly for, kind of feature flags? So why do you have to use something like Google Analytics, Optimizely, Launch Darkly, for feature flags, for A/B testing? And we think there should be like a single platform to do all of those things. And we think PostHog is going to be that. But that is the kind of future vision of it.
And in terms of the project itself, it is an open source platform, but you've also built a business around it. So I'm wondering what your plans are in terms of the business model and your overall approach to project governance to ensure that the open source aspects continue to be useful and attractive to people who are finding it, but at the same time sustainable and something that you're able to run with in the long term.
We haven't been around for very long, but at the moment, our core focus is our open source product. So, we want to make sure that that foundational layer is there and that works great and it's really pleasant to use. We want those, that toolbar that we talked about, that to be amazing and that to work really well. And we want, an individual developer to be able, at any size company, from a 2-person startup all the way to the Ubers of the world, to be able to pick up our tool and start using it straight away. That's where we're going to start, and that's where our focus is going to be. And we have investors who totally understand that, and that's going to be our focus. In terms of monetization, we never want to charge individual developers. We don't want to charge very small teams. We think the people that will be able to pay for what we're building and who will get the most value out of it in that sense is the large enterprises, and that's why we're talking about kind of an all-encompassing platform where we have things like A/B tests, we have things like feature flags, and those really only come into play when you're a large organization. If you're in your sort of proverbial bedroom coding up your first site, A/B testing is not that relevant to you. So that's kind of how we're thinking of segmenting it. But the core stuff that we're working on now, that kind of analytics capability, event ingestion, that toolbar, that's all going to be free forever, and that's going to be very much open source.
And as far as the landscape and the exercise of building a product analytics platform, what are some of the most complex, complicated, or misunderstood aspects that you've encountered?
The biggest one is probably the biggest one's probably usability, more so than obviously all of inserting millions of events a day is kind of an interesting technical challenge. In the end, it tends to be a little bit of optimization and a little bit of just buy bigger servers. The real challenge is building an analytics tool that everyone can use. And that's why we're thinking about these things like the toolbar, etc., because we want it to be really easy to unlock kind of insights from our product. And the way to do that, we think, is not going to be easy. And, I'm personally not a great UX designer, for example. So it's a real concentrated effort from everyone to make sure that we build a best in class analytics platform that's wonderful to use.
And as far as your experience of building PostHog, what have you found to be the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
So before this, I'd never built an open source project, maybe a contribution here and there, but hadn't really contributed much to open source, hadn't worked much with open source. And, open source is amazing. And I know I'm about 20 years late to the party, but especially if you're building something that's meant for developers, we basically tell all founders that we meet with, we tell them, like, try open source, because the quality of feedback is so much better than if you're doing kind of a SaaS application that's stuck behind a paywall. Because developers can just pick it up, and developers are really picky people. They will tear apart what you've done, and they'll give some really honest, direct feedback. And it's great, because that's the only way you can make your product better. And we get hundreds of bits of feedback versus if we had to go out and sell this like one-on-one. We have gotten like tens of bits of feedback, and it wouldn't be very honest, because they would like be trying to drive us down on price or whatever it is. So having something that's open source is a great way to build a product. And the open source community is great. And we're kind of building this company with that ethos as well. So our handbook is online in the same way that GitLab's is. Like, we're super transparent about a roadmap, about what we're thinking, about how we work, and we want to just keep that up and make sure that we really give back to the open source community. But that's been the most amazing thing about building PostHog.
And when is PostHog the wrong choice, and somebody would be better served using the Google Analytics of the world or some of the other open source offerings that are maybe more limited in scope?
So Google Analytics, and special shout out to Matoma, who are obviously kind of the open source equivalent of that. Those are great options if like I said, you have kind of a website where you care more about things like sessions and clicks, and how long are people spending on my site, and on average, what is the most popular article on my website, and where are my visitors coming from in the world? Those kind of questions, they tend to be a lot better at asking it. PostHog would be possibly overkill for those use cases. So yeah, there's a bunch of ways that those tools would be better.
And are there any other aspects of your work on PostHog or the process of building out a product analytics platform or its utility, or just anything else about the topic at hand that we didn't discuss that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
I think we covered it. I do want to give possibly another shout out to doing something like this open source. Even if you are planning on eventually making it a paid and closed source product, but open source has just been a revelation to us. So that's been the kind of best thing to come out of this.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, or give it a try and contribute, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week, I'm going to choose The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's a great book. I've read it a couple of times and just recently started revisiting it with my family in an audiobook. So just always worth going back to and reading it for the first time, or reading it again if it's been a little while. So definitely recommend that if you're looking for something to keep you entertained. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Tim. Do you have any picks this week?
Yeah. So one book I recently read is Triumph of the City by Edward Glaser. No relation. You spell his surname differently as well. But it's about 10 years old, and it talks about the way to a sustainable, poverty-free world is cities, and especially now with obviously Corona and a lot of chatter on Twitter about people moving to barns in Kansas or whatever. It's a really interesting read, and reminding us like why people go to cities in the first place, and why they're so such a great way of being really environmentally friendly, and a great way of lifting people out of poverty. So that was a really good read.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and discuss the work that you're doing on PostHog. It's definitely a very interesting product, and one that I intend to start experimenting with and using for my own purposes, and probably at my work as well. So thank you for all of your time and effort on that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, Tobas. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, the Data Engineering Podcast, at dataengineeringpodcast.com for the latest on modern data management. And visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@podcastinit.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.